All right, we are recording. Good afternoon, folks, and it's nice to be with you again. I'm here in Pennsylvania mostly, but also New Jersey in the United States with our two faculty members, Kira and Caroline, and with my tremendous helper, Paula. Paula, again, thank you for helping us get this lesson organized, and thank you to Kira and Caroline for working with us through this topic. We had a faculty meeting the other evening, and one of the points that came out during that meeting, and Kira, I wonder if you could just comment on it, is how connected all of these, we studied them as kind of separate domains, but in the end, they're all connected, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing how much everything plays into each other and how helpful it is to be able to have all of these different angles to look at everything
Yeah.
from.
I'm thinking the OT lesson, we had Hadley and Jesse talking to us about sort of working with the children on life skills like washing dishes and brushing teeth. That's also an opportunity to introduce speech, right?
Absolutely.
And reinforce it. And I know one of the things you're going to talk about in this upcoming lesson is those extension and extenders, things that we can help the children to build upon a few basic words. And there again, in the occupational therapy one, we can be using that technique as we're talking with the child to help them build a bit more of a vocabulary and a response, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. Well, let's jump into this one. You said in lesson 2, we dealt more with early communicators,
Right.
and now we're going to talk about later communicators. Not late communicators, but later communicators. Tell us a little bit about what that terminology means.
Right. So that's just differentiating between when you say early communicator, you're thinking about someone whose speech is more similar to maybe a toddler's speech. So maybe they haven't started saying too many words yet, or maybe they're only saying a handful of words. And then later communicator is kind of a catch-all term for someone who's past that stage, but still isn't at the same level speech-wise
Oh, I
as
see.
another child of the same age.
Well, that brings up a question in my mind. And Caroline, maybe I'll go to you with this one. How as a teacher, how do we figure out where the child is in their language development? Like, I know there are probably formal tools to do that, but how do you generally do that as a teacher or even as a parent, for example?
Um, I don't think there are super cut and dry rules because, I mean, you're gonna have it's all a continuum, right?
Mm,
Like, you might be good with one thing but not with another, and you'll find that like motivating areas of topics,
okay.
like something the child really likes, they might have a lot more ability to communicate about that. But then when you're talking about like needs that they are less interested in, they might have less of a less of an ability to, or they're still developing those
Yeah,
skills, because often you develop things that you want first.
sure.
Right.
So,
um,
And just to go off of that a little bit, even for someone who has been doing speech therapy for a long time, it can be difficult to tell, especially with young children, if they're just a late bloomer or if they
um,
are having more significant difficulty than that.
okay, so you use the term late bloomer. I'm going to presume that means as you're looking at sort of that age group, their peers, you're noticing one child, for example, they may have some words, they may have some communications, but they're not at the level of the others.
Right.
But you're sort of anticipating at some point it's going to sort of work for them, right? And they
Yeah.
sort of bloom with their language. It just
Yeah.
might be a little bit later on than their peers.
Exactly. So like Caroline said, it's a continuum and
Hmm.
every child is different. So there's some children that are going to be really excited about chatting and they'll go up to any adult and say hi and, any kid and say, what's your name? And they'll talk really early. And then you'll have other kids that are a little bit more on the shy side maybe, or maybe they really like running and, playing with the ball and they don't really care as much about talking to the other kids running around with them. And so they'll be really fast and really stable and balanced, but not saying as much. So the skills just all develop at slightly different times for each individual child.
So as a teacher, you're kind of watching the overall performance, if you will, the language performance of that child. And so long as it's within kind of a normal band of what you might expect, like you said, if they're a shy child, they're not going to be as talkative, or they're going to be a little more reserved. If they're a little more outgoing, they might be out front, but it's sort of within a band.
Right.
Is it fair to compare those children to their peers in terms of language development? Like most kids at this age are saying,
right.
things like that.
It is fair, and it's actually helpful because
Okay.
usually if you're looking at a classroom of children, they'll all live in the nearby area. They'll have pretty similar experiences growing up, so they will probably be exposed to the same sorts of activities and words and things like that. So they'll probably be learning generally similar things to each other.
Okay.
And so it's actually, so here oftentimes, if a child has a speech and language deficit, it'll often be the teacher at their school that notices first.
Oh, I see.
They'll say, oh, when I look at them in the group, there's that one kid that's just not quite doing what all the other kids are doing.
Okay.
Or something like that. And so
so it can be at least a gauge, right?
Yeah,
you sort of get a sense of how that child is doing.
Another thing I just wanted to mention quickly is that children generally develop kind of one skill set at a time. So like they might be either developing their motor skills or developing their speech skills. So that's why some kids will walk at like 8-9 months and then they won't talk again until they're a year and a half old, or vice versa. So if you're seeing some growth in one area and you're not seeing it in another area, that's kind of normal.
Oh, okay. So are they like channeling all their energy into
learning to walk or learning to
Okay. I didn't realize that. I just thought they kind of all happened at one time. So but like you said, Caroline, it's just so different for
everybody. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So when we're looking at later communicators, then those kids who might either blossom later, do they also potentially have at some point you kind of figure out they're not blossoming, they're kind of reached that point where they should have kind of caught up now. What are the kinds of speech challenges that we see in those kinds of kids? What are some of the more common ones you run into?
A lot of times it'll be that they are having more grammatical errors in their speech than the other children their age, or they'll be speaking in less complicated sentences. So maybe just a short sentence instead of a long explanation. And then another thing that we often see is that they have trouble telling a story. Like if you ask them, what did you do with your family yesterday? It'll be harder for them to relay the information about what happened, not because they don't know what happened, but because the language skills to put together a narrative are an area where they often have trouble.
So is that a cognitive processing challenge, or is it a speech challenge, or are they sort of the same thing kind of?
They can be mixed together, and it's usually more of a language challenge where it's the connecting words between things. Like if I wanted to tell you what I did this morning, I would say, first I did this, then I did that, next this happened. And so all those connecting pieces, those are concepts in language that develop later than just the words do.
I see, because now I have to describe a sequence.
Yeah.
First this, then this. And that's a more complicated language processing, more sophisticated language processing ability to do that. And they might just tell you one thing.
Or they might be a little mixed up in how they tell it, or
Okay.
get too details but leave out the overall picture, different things like
Now
that.
that's sounding an awful lot like me some days. So I just trying to bring those ideas together. So one of the things you talk, well, let me just go back and check. Caroline, are there any other kind of behaviors or speech challenges we see with the later communicators?
No, Kara kind of hit that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Thank you. I know that in your lesson this week that we're going to review, you talk about this concept of expansion and extensions. Kira, maybe I'll ask you to do this one. Would you help us just understand a little bit about what that terminology means? And
Sure.
more importantly, for me as a teacher, how do I use that information to help the child?
Right. So expansions and extensions are just both ways of helping the student to see how they can make whatever they just said a little more complicated. So it's modeling for them a way to add a little more information to what they said. And
so which one is that?
Well, so that's both of them.
That's
they're,
both.
They're subsets. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
And before I go into the individual expansions and extensions, I just want to say it doesn't make a big difference if you know which name goes to which one.
Right. As long as you get the general concept here.
Yeah, I always mix up the names of them, but the idea behind them, that these are different ways to add complexity to the student's language. That's the important part.
Okay.
But having said that, I'll go into them just for the sake of explanation. So an expansion is when you say exactly what the student said, but add something. So if they said one word, if they said water, you can say cold water. If they say, I really like her shoes, you could say, I really like her shoes because they're red.
So you expand upon that initial simple idea by adding a little bit of, I think of, I don't know if this will make sense to our teacher friends, but we use the term color commentary, you know, where you fill it in with a little bit of, and I don't mean literally red or green, but I mean with a little more words around it to make it a bit more interesting, but also to give the listener a little bit more detail about what that subject is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And this one I think is a little harder to get in the habit of doing because we don't usually repeat what someone else said with more detail.
We don't?
I mean, maybe sometimes, but it can be really helpful because this is a model for the student as to one idea of how they can be a little more complicated with what they said.
So by your modeling that, you're hoping the next time the student points something out, there's a bird, you're hoping you're trying to guide them to there's a pretty bird or there's a big bird or whatever.
Or there's a bird in the tree.
Yeah. Okay.
So it doesn't always have to be adjectives. It can be anything to make it a little.
So even an idea kind of added on there. Okay. That's an expander. We're kind of expanding the initial thought or the initial presentation of that idea. Okay.
Right. And then the other one that's in the lesson is extensions. And so that is turning whatever they say into a conversation. So I find it to be usually easiest to ask a follow-up question to extend what they said into a conversation.
Oh, I see.
But it can be any way to extend the conversation. So if someone says, I have a cookie, you can say, ooh, I love cookies. It's not a question, it's a statement, but they might ask, what kind do you like? Or they might ask, do you want a bite or something? But it's inviting them to say something else.
I see. This is a really good life skill.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the ability to establish a conversation and continue the conversation, a dialogue, is an important life skill.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you make friends at dinner parties.
That's how you make friends at parties, right? There you go.
Yep.
Okay. So
And
with,
another way you can extend is you can even just pause and look at the child and wait for them to add something. So if they say there's a bird, you can give them a little more time, and maybe on their own they'll say it's in the tree, or whatever.
okay.
To give more information.
So an extender is used as a device to kind of draw the student into a more expanded conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to guess in a classroom that might be, you have to be careful about where and how you use that. You may not
Mm-hmm.
want the child going off to a conversation about something that's not related, but still, you're trying to develop a conversational language with the child.
Right. And you can also tell the child to direct whatever they were saying to another child if it's appropriate at the time, whatever the activity is. So if they're like, maybe it's meal time, they're having their lunch and they just want to keep telling you what they're eating, you can say, well, why don't you ask your friend, what they brought from home today, and try to get the conversational skills. Because oftentimes students with communication difficulties will have an easier time talking to adults. And so working on these skills with another child is also something that can be
That's
beneficial
interesting.
for them.
So they can do better with adults than they do with their peers.
Adults tend to be a little more patient with off-the-wall comments and things
Oh,
like
I see.
that.
Okay. So in both of these cases, in the extensions and expansions, it's not so much about how they pronounce the word, or in this case about the sequence of the events. It's providing that guidance and the model to embellish, to put some color around their conversation that helps them develop a richer vocabulary and to Caroline's point, a more conversational style of communications.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Caroline, anything when you're working with your patients, any tips or techniques in that area that you have found to be particularly helpful?
I really like this area, not only because this is, okay, let me think through this. So it can be really telling about a child's skills when you're doing the extending, seeing how they react to your extensions, but also leaving them the ability to try doing it back to you. And whether or not they pick up on conversational danglers is another term that we call it. So like, if I said to you, oh, I really love cookies, eventually you'd really want to, after a while, you'd really want to ask me, okay, what kind of cookies do you like? And so, teaching those kind of skills is so important, because again, this is how you make friends at dinner parties.
Right. So you're alluding to sort of an opening up a space for the child to provide additional information or an additional response. Sometimes, does that mean, we ask a yes or no question, we might get a yes or no answer, right? Whereas if you ask the child to describe something, or to, instead of saying, have you ever made cookies at home, you might ask something like what is your favorite kind? I guess that's still kind of a yes, no.
It's hard because it's hard to give a good example of this, because as adults, we're so used to like we lead the conversation, but this is also kind of going into what Kira was saying, because why, like, sometimes it's easier to talk to adults because we are so used to leading the conversation, but it's so important for children to learn how to lead the conversation, because when they're talking to their peers, they're not going to have the expertise of the adult to fall back on.
Interesting. So is that like turn sharing, or taking
Yeah,
your turns in conversation and learning how to do that?
knowing how to take conversational turns. It's all part of pragmatics,
Yeah.
the study of how we interact with each other, more or
Okay.
less.
Caroline, in your work with kids who are in this late communicator, do you ever use games or toys? Are there props that you can use that help
Um, all the time.
all the time?
Yeah. If it's not fun, kids don't want to do it.
Mm,
So I tend to work primarily with early communicators.
okay.
So this is a little bit less of what I do.
Hmm.
Um, there are a lot of products that are available in the US that I've heard of, but
Hmm.
um, the other thing too, if you're not privy to those products, children learn through play. So
Mm,
you can play a kitchen with them, and there's so many opportunities for, first of all, functional language, because you're pretending to do something that children will be a part of. But
right.
also, I mean, oh, what should we make first? Should we make the pizza or the cookies? And
Hmm.
oh, what kind of cookies do you want to, it's easy to kind of use that as a way to extend.
So it's almost like that activity becomes a bit of a distractor, right? They're excited about it. Hopefully they
Yeah.
want to do it, and you can build upon that then as you're having the conversation that hopefully draws them a bit more into the dialogue.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Um, I'm going to go back to Kira on this one. Kira, there was a term that you used, which I do not understand in the lesson, called spontaneous utterance. Can you help us understand that one a little bit?
Sure. So spontaneous utterance is anything the child says on their own without having been prompted to say something.
Okay.
And spontaneous utterances, it helps us know what the child's interested in
Mm,
and what they're thinking about at the moment. And if they tell you something without you asking them a question or prompting them to tell you something,
mm-hmm,
then you know it's something that they're interested in.
mm,
And so whenever they do come out with something just completely on their own, that's a great time to use some of these strategies for making language more
because
complex.
something is motivating them, right? They,
Exactly.
they either have a need or they have an interest in something. I'm excited about playing with the ball or whatever it might be.
Exactly.
So you want to grab that as a teacher, and because they're already kind of motivated to talk about that topic. Caroline, I'm going to say, just like adults, right? You bring up a topic that's of interest to me, and um, and then we can begin to do the expansion exercises or the extension exercises, because it's a topic that they kind of own, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe
Or
it's a
even get
pet.
into a new play activity.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I was working with a little boy at the table, and I forget what we were working with, but there was something on my hands. I stepped over to the sink to rinse them off, and he immediately, his face lit up, and he goes, "Wash." Because he wanted to wash his hands. And I was like, okay, this is a great opportunity to use a whole different set of words than we were just working on,
Interesting.
and he was really excited to wash his hands. And I never would have known that if it wasn't for his spontaneous utterance, because I had no intention of asking him about it because I
Right.
didn't think washing hands was going to be that fun.
But maybe water and the splashing, and
Yeah.
it's a fun activity, and kids tend to like kind of playing with water.
Yeah.
That's a great example. That's good. Wait, which brings me to another thought I wanted to get both from you and Caroline on. We started off talking about how important all of these topics we've been talking about, special education and PT and OT and now speech, and that they're really all interconnected and interrelated. I think about the environment for a child. and what their day is like. They've got a home life of some sort. They've got family members and perhaps friends and maybe extended family members. They've got uh, school activities. As sort of a formal, I go to school and I do something for a period of time. And then maybe after that, then I'm doing something of play, right? Or maybe an after school activity. I might belong to a sport or a club or something. So I was wondering if you have any tips and techniques or tricks that you've used that have helped the people in those other settings, whether it's at home or in those clubs. Have you helped make the transition so that if you're working with a child on a particular speech skill set, you can develop face extension or that extension, that's something you're also work with the parents on? How do
Mhm.
you do that? Tell me like what that's like for you.
So I think that this was something that Caroline might have mentioned in an earlier lesson, but that's incredibly important and also can be very difficult because families are really busy and there's a lot going on, and a lot of times there's stuff you just have to get done.
Hmm.
Um, but if you're able to have good conversations with the parents, like for myself, I usually write a note that I send home with the student and then encourage the parent to write back to tell them, this is what we're working on. This is what he was really excited about. So it'll be something like, today he was really excited to play with a little dinosaur toy.
Mm.
And so we were working on pretending the dinosaur was eating different things. So what we were really working on was the words for these different foods.
Mm.
And instead of just saying eat apple, eat
Mhm.
bread, and so using that expansion strategy in that and encouraging the family, if there is an opportunity to do something similar or an opportunity to get the child involved in whatever activities are happening in the home. So fallback that I feel like, I mean, every family has to cook at some point in their day because everybody has
Sure,
to eat.
sure.
And so that can be a really good time to get the child involved. If they're able to help prepare the food, you can work on words like stir and pour. And if they're not able to help prepare the food, they can still have maybe a bowl and a spoon or something like that, so that they're still learning about the words and the activity, even if they're not right with you doing it. And so I try to give examples of both what we did in school and something similar that they might be able to do at home, either with their parent or with an older sibling or a cousin, whoever it might be that
Mm.
is around and often interacting with the child.
Caroline, you're in a slightly different setting because you're not in a school setting. How do you help make that transfer from the kinds of activities you're doing to a different setting, whether it's home or a club or play activity?
I tell you that it is the most frustrating part of my job.
Oh no, how
Um,
come?
um, it's I work with a lot of families who don't have or who feel that they don't really have the energy to go home and put a lot of effort into providing this kind of input to their children. It's not something
They're
that comes
just in survival mode, sort of.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. And it's
yeah.
not their first, their first issue. Their number one is trying to pay the bills. Number two is getting their kids' homework done, and number three is getting the laundry done. And
Mm,
again, it's survival mode, and
yeah.
um, it's
Mm,
it's not something that necessarily comes naturally to adults. Like
mm-hmm,
learning how to do all of this stuff, especially not in our culture, at least here.
mm-hmm.
And there's also this general feeling that like you're the professional, you fix them.
Oh boy.
I got them here. That's my part.
Oh boy.
Um, and so, every week I just kind of, I tell the family what we worked on. I give them some ideas for how they can
Mhm.
work on it at home. But I don't, I've learned which families I can kind of expect that they'll do the
Yeah.
therapy, and other families I don't expect as much from.
Tell us about one that really worked for you, like one family that a child situation where you were doing something in your setting and you communicated with the parent, and then now you've got two resources coming. Like, what's that like?
Well, I recently had a kid who was working on understanding the difference between big and little, and mom went head first into it
Mm,
and made all these things at home and practiced big and little all the time. And as they were in the bus on their way to, wherever they were going, school, work, whatever, she would point out the big tree and then she would point out the little tree.
mm.
And, he understood the concept in like 2 weeks. Whereas I have other kids whose parents didn't do that. And we've been working on it for 2 months. And
Yeah,
we're getting closer, but
right. But if it's
thanks.
just you,
Right.
right? It's
There's
just
a
you in an isolated setting.
right. There's only
That's
so much I can do in a half an hour once a week.
right.
Parents are really in the position of getting the most done most of the time because A, they have more time, they're around their children more, and B, kids respond well to parents most of the time.
Most of the time, right? Right.
Yeah. I
It's
mean,
a trusted. It's a trusted,
a
family
relationship,
member. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And how about siblings? Have you ever had a opportunity where a sibling kind of got involved and was helping out, or?
I have not.
Oh,
I
okay.
tend to treat siblings. I have a lot of kids on my caseload where I see the older brother and then I see the younger brother, and
Oh, I see.
um,
I see.
there is a genetic component to language disorders,
Oh,
so it's not uncommon. But I mean, I could see that being one of the best ways for kids to learn, because
mm,
everybody always wants to do what their big brother is doing, right? Like,
right, right,
it,
right.
I feel like that would be great.
So if you can motivate that big brother or big sister to
Exactly.
help their little one out, I don't
Yeah,
know, maybe they get a prize or something, or they get
right.
praised or something. That could be really a big win, right?
I mean, you might be prepping them for their future career in speech pathology.
We'll make him a speech pathologist after all. Oh,
Exactly.
that's very good. Okay. So it sounds to me as though in this whole unit, we've covered a wide range of topics, and we better understand that speech therapy is not just pronunciation or word finding. It's not just one thing. It's a whole mix of things. And in of all the topics, I mentioned this before we started recording, but of all of the topics, it seems to me speech is the most integral throughout all of the other ones. I know you're special,
I totally agree. We are the most important.
but it is important because it's obviously in cases where it's working well. It is the method of communication is through speech, through verbal, but it doesn't mean that it stops there. The verbal may be, Kira, you mentioned maybe very short words or incomplete sentences or fragments of ideas. So there's still work to be done, even though you're getting them. You're getting some response back. There's still work to help continue to develop that speech. It becomes more fluent, more conversational, and as Caroline said earlier, sort of age appropriate for that particular group. So we recognize the importance of speech throughout this. Um, you've posted. We've got one more lesson. Paula, thank you again for helping us get that lesson up and posted. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're looking for in the discussion forum for this week?
So this week, we'd really like to hear, so we've already heard about some strategies that the teachers have been trying, and how it's been going. And so if there's any more information about that, we would love to hear it, especially if there's anything that they'd like to problem solve together. And then any of the strategies from this new lesson, if they haven't gotten a chance to try them yet, letting us know how they're thinking of working them in, and what different thoughts they're having on that. And then just one more opportunity to point out if there were any gaps and things that they were hoping to get from this module that we didn't end up covering yet.
Okay.
So mostly looking for more information on anything that has gone on so far, and being able to answer any questions or anything like that.
Okay, so we've got a lesson posted. We got a discussion forum posted as well, and Kira and Caroline would like to hear any cases, any specific challenges that might be presented to you teachers that you'd like to get a little bit more, that are kind of speech related, that you might get a little bit more insight from Kira and Caroline on how they go about approaching those in their therapy session. So thank you for that. Paula, before we sign off, I always like to go to you. Are there any questions or anything in your mind?
This is going back to lesson 2, and where Noelle in the post had a question about using the mirror. And at first I didn't know what he meant, but then Kira responded, quite lengthy post, and I didn't know whether maybe some of the other teachers would be using mirrors to kind of help with the physical part of word pronunciation. I wasn't sure about that, and so because no one else seemed to say anything, but obviously Noelle brought that up and thought it was an issue. So I just wanted to throw it out there, because if the teachers, if they're viewing this, we've already identified that as a strategy, using a mirror to have the student practice pronunciation, and the easier pronunciations. Kara, you gave these 2 charts, and I don't know if they would like to have them as a way to start with the easiest one, letter combinations, to add to the more complex ones, but start easy and move down the chart. So I thought those were really helpful. That's it. Okay,
good. Thank you, Paula. Kira, Caroline, anything last thoughts on your mind for this week?
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we got it.
Terrific. Well, thank you all again for joining us this evening here in the States. First part of your day there in Boyou, Cameroon, at St. Rita's. And we will again do our last video recording at the end of this week on Sunday evening, where Kira and Caroline will look at any of the information, any questions you might have remaining, anything about this particular lesson that might stimulate a thought about a challenge or a barrier. So please take advantage of having experts with us who might be able to answer your questions. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. God bless you. And thank you again for the team joining us here today. Okay, take care all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.